very strong risk that you're going to need to run to your boss and say, oh, by the way, I tried this thing out. You're going to get an invoice of $10,000.
Exactly. Hello, everybody. This is Eric Axelrod with the Cloud Data Summit podcast, and I'm interviewing Rasmus Bang today. And Rasmus, could you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Of course. As you said, my name is Rasmus. I am an independent consultant specializing in all things BI and big data, master data. I'm working mainly as an architect, and I've worked as an architect for many different projects in many different organizations. I'm based in Denmark, in Europe. So I'm very curious to share some experiences from here and see how they resonate with where you're from, Eric.
Excellent. And tell me a little bit more about your company. So you do architecture work. You know, what's
Yes.
the most kind of common types of projects that you work on, or common types of roles that you end up working with?
Well, typically it's roles where organizations say we need to do something about the way we store data or the way we analyze data, and we've been working in the traditional BI paradigm for a long time. But something seems to be happening, something seems to be shifting, and we don't know what to make of it. So typically I go in and I help them try and find out, well, where would it make sense to use a traditional BI platform, a data warehouse? Where does it make sense to use a big data platform? What technologies are we looking at? When should we consider working in a cloud setting? When does it make more sense from an on-premise setting? So it's very much sort of drawing the initial things for customers and organizations who know that they need to do something, but they don't know exactly what it is, and they don't know exactly what it means.
Excellent. And I know that's a very, very, very common problem with all sorts of companies. Even the very, very large ones have very similar sorts of issues that we run into pretty often.
Yes.
And whenever you're actually working with your customers, what types of BI and big data technologies do you usually see them using? What do they have installed in their legacy stack?
Well, I think one of the things that might be a little bit different compared to where you're at is that, I mean, being based in Europe and being based in a small country just north of Germany, we see an awful lot of SAP. So there's a lot of, in many Danish production companies, you see a lot of SAP Business Warehouse, you see a lot of HANA, you see a lot of business objects. And I think probably much more than you do many other areas in the world. I think, for instance, something like Teradata is more or less absent from the Danish IT landscape. So a lot of SAP technology, basically, on the BI side. Microsoft has gained much more of a foothold in the last, I'd say, in the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years than before with the whole Power BI suite, Power BI world. I think my impression is that it's gone from being something that that architects like myself have tried to push out to being something that is, allowed in the door. Because I think for 2 reasons. I think people have realized that there's really nothing, there's no way to fight it, and also because some of the immaturity issues that have been there earlier are, it's getting more to an enterprise ready state.
Right. So is that something that they've been struggling with maybe for the last few years, is trying to implement something like Power BI and just figured out that it wasn't quite ready yet, and now they're a little bit more apt to go down that road?
I think it is, and I think it's very much to do with the the traditional thoughts of trying to, if you try to implement an enterprise data warehouse, then how do you deal with people using a Power BI platform to, well, how do you avoid the situation again that you've had for years, if not decades, where people have had their Excel solutions and their Power BI and their Tableau and their whatever it might be, and have tried to make these, I don't know, shadow BI platforms, and that's where I see some of the, the tipping point here is that at the moment it's actually it's being allowed in the door, so it's no longer something that people try and fight. It's something where people go, all right, well, if we have to, then let's just,
Yes.
yeah.
And that has been a pretty big change that I've seen as well over the last, really over the last 5 years. I think it's been really, really big, where it's been a very much a shift from like the monolithic enterprise BI design, where it's something that is fully controlled and fully governed by the IT department, to where it's a much more self-service model. And there's a lot more organizations that have been a lot more open to the idea of doing that. And of course, I think a big part of it is the realization that that their business people use Excel anyway. They've been using Excel for a very, very long time, and really since day one, and that none of their legacy BI platforms have really ever met the needs of their business users, because if they did, they wouldn't be resorting to Excel, which is the way that it's always been, right? And so I think that's been a big realization for a lot of companies that said, wow, we have this big thing, and everybody around here calls them spread marts, where we have, our organization has hundreds of thousands of spreadsheets that we use on a monthly basis, and we want to get out of that. Now, you're probably never going to get out of it, right? But we want to decrease that number. We want to get that to a more governed platform than where it is, that enables the business users, right? Versus what they're doing now is you're just going to go into business objects and you're going to download a bunch of rows of data and put them into Excel and then do whatever with them, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think it's a very, very interesting paradigm over the last few years with that, and it's no, I find it interesting that you're seeing the same thing on that side of the pond as well, especially with a very heavy SAP usage.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And I think on the big data side of things, I think what I typically experience are different flavors of Hadoop. I know it's it's something that's shifting a lot these days. But typically it's Cloudera, it's Hortonworks. I guess it's all Cloudera right now. But those are the two big things. I've seen a little bit of MapR, but I think, the big three, or the big two, or however many there are right now, is typically what people are using from a more of a big data point of view.
And I'm curious, just because of kind of where you are geographically, do you see Exasol as well?
Sorry?
Do you see a fair amount of Exasol as well in your part of the world?
It's not something I've run into. Not apart from conferences. It's not something I've seen out in the wild here.
Interesting. I don't remember exactly. They're based somewhere in Germany. I don't remember where their home base is exactly, but I figured that they would be pretty similar to SAP and have a pretty good footprint on in that part of the world. Because and that's something that I've seen for a long time. And it's not even just country based. There's a lot of cities in the U.S. that have been very heavy to adopt certain technologies. And so, like for example, I've been in the St. Louis area for a long time, and St. Louis has been very traditionally heavy on the SAP side of ERP, and has been very traditionally. We were a big business object city back in the day, and IBM barely had any presence at all with Cognos in our part of the world, and and so that's just kind of something, that's kind of the way that it's always been. And then if you go to the coasts as well, if you look at New York or San Francisco or one of those, you're going to see a completely different type of technology landscape that companies tend to use. And it's not even just startups. It's a lot of more of the enterprise tech companies as well. They're going to be a lot more apt to do custom code. They're going to be a lot more apt to use Hadoop technologies versus what we're going to see around here, where people are on SAP, they're on Oracle, they're on Microsoft, and that's just, it's a very kind of interesting geographic paradigm based upon, I think it's really kind of based upon where the big monoliths have been focusing their sales efforts, right? And where they've been able to get traction.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting, paradigm. How do you typically see collaboration at your customers? Whenever you have different departments that are trying to get things done, you have different roles that are trying to work with each other. How do you see that playing out whenever you are on the ground working with customers?
Yeah. That's actually a very good question. I think it's it varies. I think from you. I mean, if we mainly look at it from maybe from the BI side of things, then you would typically, what I see is some kind of BICC-ish model where you have your back-end people, your front-end people sort of from on the BI side, and then you have some kind of BICC or center of excellence somewhere in the middle in the interface between IT and the sort of the quote-unquote business. And that's where, I guess that's sort of the clean model. But then the interesting thing is, well, then what do you have on the business side of things? Because one of the things I did before I started out on my own was I was enterprise architect for BI and analytics at Lego, the toy company, and they had at that point a very, I almost want to say, sprawling model for business collaboration, because apart from a BICC and IT, then they had maybe 4 or 5 different centers of excellence out in the different business areas. So in finance, and HR, and supply chain, all these different areas. So there, it tends to be a quite long chain of people needing to collaborate in order to get this done. Whereas if you look at it from the sort of the more big data sciencey side of things, this is one of the areas where I see many organizations struggling, and I think it's mainly got to do with not technology, but more organization and politics, because you're in a situation where for many years you've had IT and you've had a business area with a need, whereas here you both need the technical side of things, the IT side of things. You need the people with business understanding and the business problems, and then also you need your statisticians or data scientists or machine learning people or whatever whatever it is, who tend to be, at least in some cases, in a completely different area. So it's one of those things where you can't have just 2 of the 3, because then you don't get anywhere. And at least in sort of larger organizations where you have a very robust, maybe a little bit dusty way of aligning and allocating people, they go, all right, well, you can have our big data team 3 weeks starting Monday. And then you go, yeah, but the data scientists aren't ready by then. So I think that's one of the things that just takes a long time for organizations to get used to.
So really what you're seeing is that they've done a decent job with traditional BI, kind of establishing those cross-functional roles where they do have a BI center of excellence, and they do have stakeholders that are crossing over between BI and the business. But then when you get to machine learning and AI and data science, they're not really doing that, right? They're kind of working in a silo, and they're really kind of struggling to be able to deliver business value, right? Because that's really what it's about.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've seen the exact same thing as well. I've seen that so many organizations that go out there and they think that hiring a data science team is going to be a panacea to whatever they do, and then they get a bunch of data, they give it to the data science work, and then the data science team, they don't really necessarily know what to work on. They don't know where the business pain is. They don't really know anything about the business process. They don't have any collaboration, right? And then so they end up, really in a lot of cases just kind of spinning their wheels, not really knowing what they're after. And I think that's kind of been a big flaw for how a lot of organizations have really constructed their data science and machine learning departments, because if you don't start with that business problem, then you're not going to, you're probably not going to be successful. You're probably not going to figure out what that business problem is just by looking at the data. And, and if you don't know what the business problem is, then you're not going to be able to solve it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I had I worked with a very, very bright guy within data science at one point, and he always said he really liked the phrase data science, and simply because it implied that you were working with data in a scientific manner. So you created your hypotheses and you gathered data and you tested it and you refined it and you accepted it or you discarded it. And I think it's, the way he said it, it was like, oh yeah, well, of course that's the way it is. But if you compare that to the, maybe the business case processes and the financial processes, many organizations, then many top level decision makers aren't going to be satisfied with an answer of, maybe this is going to give us some huge insights, maybe it's not, who knows. So that's I think there's I think there's some room for improvement in the maybe the appetite for uncertainty for many of these things.
Absolutely, but I do think that has a really big part of knowing why you're starting down a data science initiative, right? It's not that we're going to hire a data science team and then we're going to there's going to be this this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that we're going to find. It's that we know you need to know where your problems lie, and if our problems are that our manufacturing plants are backed up, we can't get orders out fast enough, we're always short on raw materials, whatever the problem is, right? It's like we need to focus on things that are the things that are contributing to that problem, and then try to reverse engineer that, rather than just nebulously going after mining data, which I guess is very much the idea, very much kind of a 1980s, 1990s idea where you can just kind of give a bunch of data miners some data and they're going to, give you a bunch of insights. And it didn't work back then and it doesn't work now either, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's very interesting. And then, so on the technology side, how have you experienced the shift going from traditional BI to big data over the last 5-10 years?
Well, it's the areas where I've seen it. It's actually been actually coming back to your point. It's typically been driven by I think two different forces. It's been driven by I'd say a curiosity or a readiness in the IT areas where they've said, well, we can see something's happening out there. We can see there's. We can see, I mean, we're reading the same in-flight magazine as everyone else, and there seems to be something that's just different. But then that has, typically only really gained traction when it's also been paired with a very sharp, business challenge or business need of some kind, where if be it finding out the challenges in your sales situation, or I think I've seen it from a supply chain point of view at one point as well, where someone from the business has said, all right, well, we really need to get this thing done, and if you're saying that this big data thing is what's going to get it done for us, then let's do that. But then I'll also say that that I've really I've experienced areas where once you have these things, once you have the the experts, both the have the platform set up and you have your data scientists, then it has really been able to show some results that really tend to blow these decision makers away. I had at one point an example of we were sitting with some customers and looking at their it was something with fraud detection on their web shop, and it was something to avoid a certain type of certain type of purchasing
Customer.
behavior.
Mm.
And this organization actually had a mechanism in place to prevent this purchasing behavior. And then we had the data scientists show their finding, and they said, all right, and then we have this guy, and he's done this from the same IP address 76 times in a row. And the business, the people there were like, what? Because they didn't think they had a challenge anymore. They thought they'd fixed it. But when you're able to really go in and say, there's something here you need to do something about. So that's just to say that has really tended to, when you have these moments, to really accelerate it. Whereas when you don't have the business side of it, then it just it tends to just be like an IT pet project for a lot longer.
Absolutely. But then, like, if you kind of wrap that around, the idea is around, customer is running traditionally, they're running SAP, they're running Oracle, they're running, all of our legacy technologies, and then they've been over the last decade going to something else, whatever that is, whether it's Hadoop or whether that's cloud or whether that is, whether you're using Spark or something like that. Have you seen a lot of momentum on that as far as people that are actually taking those initiatives and saying, okay, we're going to go rebuild our core platform on some other platform?
Yeah, I've seen it. Maybe not the. I think people are still hesitating. At least the people I've seen on the core platforms, but I definitely see it a lot on the on the sort of the edge platforms. So you have things like, obviously Salesforce. You have things like cloud solutions for HR, SuccessFactors, and Workday.
Certainly.
For what's it called? The buyer portals. So most places I've been, people are they're getting an appetite to sort of try out many of the newer I guess software service solutions for non-core areas, but for the sort of the key ERP, I don't think I've seen a lot of organizations who've really been gutsy enough to say, all right, we're going to do it.
And I think we've seen something very similar in the States as well, where a lot of companies are doing specifically on the BI side is they're implementing what a number of organizations have termed a tier 2 data warehouse, where they're not going to retire their legacy one. If they're running an Oracle data warehouse on since the 1980s, they're going to keep that on, and they're probably not going to change anything about it. And then what they're going to do is they're going to take another new technology and lay it on top of the old one. So they're going to, they're going to buy, they're going to buy one of the newer technologies, or they're going to buy a cloud platform or something like that, and then they're just going to kind of migrate a subset of the data up to that new platform, and then they're going to buy another set of tools because they don't want to impact the legacy platform. They'll buy a Tableau, they'll buy a Looker, they'll buy a Click, they'll do something like that and lay it on top of their new data warehouse. That'll be their new platform, but the old one is still around. And so I'm sure just because of the time and expense to be able to migrate off of that's what organizations are really doing all over the world, because I have been at a number of them where a number of Fortune 500 size orgs where we're in there kind of looking at their infrastructure, and they're like, we want to get off of our legacy platforms entirely. And they'll budget it. They'll be like, wow, this is a $100 million project, and they'll figure that out. And they're like, okay, it's going to be 4 years just to rewrite our ETL jobs in another tool or something like that. And then they're like, okay, well, we're not going to do that. And so instead, they're just going to say, okay, let's go rewrite some parallel things and load them into this other we're going to keep this, legacy system kind of on life support indefinitely,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
it's going to be so expensive to move off of it. And it's probably not practical to do. I mean, even if they're paying millions a year in license fees
Mm-hmm.
and infrastructure fees, it's going to be a really long ROI to be able to turn those legacy platforms off if they really have to spend double-digit millions of dollars on project work to rewrite everything, right?
Yeah.
So that's definitely been a big thing that we've seen that's kind of been, I'm not going to say that's been a barrier, but it's a very interesting paradigm where it introduces a lot of other problems whenever you're running parallel systems. There's not only technical issues, but there's a lot of business process issues that you run into. So it's been a very interesting thing. You kind of touched on Hadoop a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
You see a lot of Hadoop ecosystem technologies that are actually in use, and I'm going to use that with a qualifier, because one of the things that we see here is that there's a lot of companies that talk about it, that say, hey, they'll go to conferences and they'll talk about how we've implemented X, Y, or Z thing, and you'll find out once you get in there that they don't actually have any of that. It's all vaporware, so there is certainly a lot of Hadoop technology that's in production, but it's a lot less than what you would think right from the wild. Curious if you kind of see the same thing over there, where there's just a lot of organizations that are still, just mostly running on their legacy systems, and then they're kind of claiming to run on a big data platform.
No, yeah, I think some of the things I've seen. There are places where you really get the impression that they are quite far, and where I think for me the key question is how many sort of more or less business critical things are running off the platform. But I've also seen areas where I've seen organizations where they have implemented a Hadoop platform, but they are still, they're really struggling with, for instance, they're struggling with data loads basically. So, well, do we use Scoop? Do we use NiFi? Do we use whatever? And when you say, well, maybe we should look into this technology, they go, ooh, that's probably something we want to be doing right now. When you go, well, there's this use case for real-time, real-time feedback and all that, and they go, yeah, but we can do it with so it's not real-time, but it's within 15 minutes, and we can do that on our old platform. So let's do that. So I think that comes back to the what's that called? The maintainability of it.
Right.
That I definitely see organizations that have said, all right, let's do this, let's implement this, and then they find out that it's probably not fair to say maturity, but definitely the way of the steps needed to keep this running and keep it watched and scripting and all that.
Keep it performant, right? Exactly.
Yeah, is much more challenging than I think they initially thought. So there, I mean, that's examples of organizations where, I mean, there is a platform and there are things running, but I think you could probably discuss the sort of at least the short-term business benefits that come from.
No, I can definitely see that. I mean, that's something that we've seen a lot of organizations struggle with as well, even the ones that actually do get something up and running. And I think that's one of the factors that really inhibits the adoption of the Hadoop platform, as they try to pile more work onto it, and they find out that it doesn't perform as well as they thought it would, or it doesn't deliver all of the, kind of the magical value that it was promised, right? And then they start to pull back a little bit, and they get a new workload, and they're like, well, do we want to put this on Hadoop, or do we want to put this on a legacy platform? And a lot of times, a legacy platform, right?
Yeah. So, and I think it's also a at least what I've also seen in those types of situations is the discussion of saying, if we have the situation where we're implementing a solution here, we need to store the data, we need to analyze and react on the data. It's relatively small data set. It's not very complex. So we know we can, we can solve the use case using our traditional BI world. So we're going to do that. And then the question becomes, well, do we also store the data in our data lake, in our big data platform? Because we know that we have a strategy of saying we want to store all the data there because we want it to be available for data science, for machine learning, for all these things. And there, I think it's always interesting to see the the discussions of, well, how much does it cost? What's the politics? I mean, how strongly can we really enforce this principle that we want to put it in, and who's going to pay for it?
It's always about politics, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
We talked a little bit about Hadoop, but if we kind of pivot the other direction, what are some of the things that are leading companies down the cloud path? And can you really kind of explain what the shift is from on-premise or private cloud systems down to public cloud? So when we're talking about AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, maybe Oracle Cloud, IBM Cloud, some of these things where the architecture is kind of different. Like, what have you seen over the last 5 to 10 years on that front?
Well, the first time I was part of implementing a Hadoop platform, we were quite clear that we wanted to go the cloud direction for different reasons, but I think the main one was the scalability and the flexibility, because what we had heard and seen from others on the the capabilities and the possibilities, this just seemed to be the right way to go, basically. And there I remember there was a lot of discussion, mainly from the sort of the infrastructure world, where people were, I think it's probably been the same in more or less every single company, but where the first impression is, well, why would you want to do that? We have a perfectly good data center right here. So I think there was the what's it called, the change management part of it. Then another thing that was a big inhibitor to begin with was finding out how do the contract models work here. I remember, without naming any names, I remember that one of the big cloud providers there was something around privacy of data where at least the in-house lawyers and the vendor simply couldn't agree, and where we ended up saying, all right, it's been good talking to you, we're gonna go with someone else. And so I think that there's been I think that's definitely been one of the shifts there, and from what I'm saying now is that's changed, I mean, tremendously over these years. People aren't afraid of cloud anymore in the way they were. And I think for me the big shift here is that infrastructure organizations aren't afraid of cloud anymore, and security organizations aren't afraid of cloud anymore. I think they were, at least in my experience, the ones that tended to hold these initiatives back, at least from what I've seen.
Exactly. That's one of the things that I've seen as well with, and one of the things that's kind of surprising me almost how quick it happened is healthcare organizations, particularly hospitals, health insurance companies, and things like that. It's, because in the U.S. we have HIPAA, which the federal government mandates a lot of things about data storage and data privacy and data destruction. We're talking about physical, like data center level things like access to hard drives and things like that. That's all regulated by the federal government, right? Yeah. And then as soon as AWS and Microsoft Azure got certified for HIPAA, then the game changed, you know, because
Yes.
now they can come down to these organizations and say all of your withholdings that you had about going to the cloud, the government says they're okay. They've certified us, it's fine now. And then that was a huge, a huge mindset shift, I think, for a lot of companies to say, wow, they say it's okay now, so maybe we can do this, even though we've been resisting this exact thing for the last, 10 years. And so it's been, it's been a very, very, and we've seen the same thing. I mean, obviously, like commercial banks and things like that don't have HIPAA regulations to worry about traditionally, but they've kind of been in the very same boat where they've, for the most part, been very, very on-premise data center, and there have been some pretty substantial moves towards the cloud. Like I think it was, what was it, in 2016, I think, that I believe it was JP Morgan Chase invested just a massive amount of money in Snowflake, with the intention of moving a huge part of their data warehouse architecture, to AWS on Snowflake, which was, and that was a huge move, because I don't believe that anybody had done that before. And, especially, in the banking sector and the financial services sector, it's all very much, historically very much an on-premise, fully managed data center type operation that they've been running. And just in the last 3 years, it's been such a massive mindset shift where people are really now start to exploring these technologies and say, wow, these really are safe. All of the things that we were worried about in our legal department, I'm worried about, these are not a concern, and so I think that's made a really big impact on the adoption from what I've seen in the last few years.
No, I completely agree. There's been a, what's it called, a sea change sort of in that area. I think also one of the sort of specifically from the from the, I guess, the big data world. I keep on trying to find a better word than big data because it's very 2016, but I just,
it is what it is.
It's not data science, it's not machine learning, it's not data warehousing. So yeah. Anyway, so from where was I? Oh yeah. So when we so when we first did this implementation of Hadoop, it was just it was complete standard. It was a Hadoop installation on the the cloud vendors infrastructure, basically. Whereas I think the big changes coming recently here is the the maturity, in a sense, massive maturity that have come from the the offerings from Amazon, from Microsoft, from Google, where you don't, all the things that we had to mess around with to get this working is really, I don't want to go as far as calling it software as a service right now, but it's definitely much closer and much mature, much more mature than it was at the time. And I think the the scalability and the flexibility that we were looking at the time, which was something that needed to be done with scripting, setting up clusters, shutting them down, all that is today more or less even built into the whole world. So I've seen examples of I mean, that's more or less the standard now, that the fact that you now just can what's it called, split up the storage and the compute parts of it is just it sounds like a small thing, and I guess conceptually it's just a very big thing, and it's something that I don't see happening in any kind of on-premise world without much more hassle.
Yeah, absolutely, and it does require a huge investment. Now, and I think you're absolutely right. That's one of the things that it does. It sounds simple, but it's such a game changer for what your ability to do, because and I've seen a lot of even before a lot of these platforms were service. I guess I should say software as a service ready for some of these tasks. I'd seen some people in the earlier days of AWS that implemented dynamically scaling ETL clusters, which is really, really interesting because, we're talking about some very heavy ETL movement tasks that would traditionally take, many, many, many hours on an on-premise, system where you're constrained by a certain number of resources. And then we can put it onto elastic compute environment, and the speed at which we can get it done is only limited to how much we're willing to pay concurrently for that. And, and then we don't have to keep those servers on when we're done with them. And so, and that's one of the great things about the idea of elastic compute is that, for the next 30 minutes, I need 100 servers. Well, you can get 100 servers for 10 minutes, and then you only pay for that 10 minutes of use, then they go away, right? And so, that's something that you can't do with on-premise, because you have to have those 100 servers, you have to have them racked, running and ready to go, which means that why wouldn't you just be running your applications on those all the time? And so, and I have seen some of the very large organizations that do have private cloud and still have some on-premise architecture. They are moving to Kubernetes and Docker Swarm for their internal applications, so they can do some of that with their bigger operations, but they're still nowhere near the scale that you can obtain through the public cloud providers, because with pretty much any provider, there is really practically no limit. I mean, any workload that you want to throw at it, it'll be able to gobble it up. And so I think that's the really interesting part versus the old world, where we say, wow, we've got, we have 24 nodes in our data warehouse cluster, and once they're maxed, they're maxed, and we can try to tune our indexes, we can try to optimize our partitions, we can try to go through our explain planes and make these things as efficient as possible, but at some point you're going to reach that point of diminishing returns, right, where you just can't really make it any faster, or it's not going to, you can't get the gains that you need to get to be able to take a workload that's going to take 24 hours and get it down to 10 minutes. It's just not going to happen, right? But if we go to the Elastic Cloud, we can do that, and it's actually very, very feasible to do. And in a lot of cases, it's actually substantially less expensive to do that in a cloud and throw 100 nodes at it in parallel, rather than running our small cluster that we have on premise or something like that. So it's been a very, very interesting model that I've seen on the cloud side. And of course, that's one of those big reasons, kind of what leads them there, right, is with them inspecting their workloads and saying, well, we really need to speed up our delivery. We really need to speed up our SLA. Our business users our business users need to have this when they get in at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we can't have it to them until noon. We've got to cut 6 hours out of our process. How are you going to cut 6 hours out of your process? Because that might be reducing it by 75%, right? And so and so I think that's good. That's one of the big things where you can actually accomplish that with elastic compute in the public cloud, whereas you're probably, or I'm not going to say that you can't do that with on-premise, but it's never going to be practical to do it with on-premise, because you have to own and maintain those servers, right?
Exactly. One thing I would say, though, on the other thing is, I heard from many people that oftentimes it would be nice to have some kind of training wheels thing in the public cloud, because when you put in your credit card, if you don't know what you're doing, then there's a very strong risk that you're going to need to run to your boss and say, oh, by the way, I tried this thing out. You're going to get an invoice of $10,000.
Exactly. No, and I've seen definitely seen the same, and it's totally off topic from what we were talking about. But I've seen some organizations that did lift and shift projects where they just said, I'm going to take my existing Oracle server and we're just going to put it in AWS. And whenever they do something like that, without doing any re-architecture or without putting it onto Elastic Platform, their cost will 3, 4, 5x. Because they go the old way, because I mean they're not eliminating the need for a DBA. They're not able to necessarily reduce any staff or anything like that. So it's still the same staffing level. And instead of taking a server that we physically owned and we had to pay cooling and power for, and we had to pay for parts, instead of doing that, where there's there's very little recurring cost to run that, all of a sudden now we're putting into this environment where it costs thousands of dollars a month to run. And and so a lot of the and then I've seen some companies that have done that at scale, where they just say, let's just take all of our private cloud infrastructure or all of our on-premise infrastructure, let's put it up in the cloud, and the bill increases substantially, and they don't really see any benefits from it because they didn't fix any of the problems.
Exactly.
They didn't and what they really need to be doing for those is kind of looking at those opportunities for to be able to use elastic compute. And if you're just moving a VM, then that's not going to get you there, right?
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. What are some of the challenges that companies face when moving to the cloud, other than unexpected costs, kind of like we touched on, or maybe you didn't get the performance benefits that you thought you would because you did a lift and shift? What are some of the other things that you kind of see that are challenges that companies are facing?
Well, that's a good question. It's typically, for me at least, the main things I see are not so many challenges in moving to the cloud, but more the concerns before moving to the cloud. I think there's sometimes, there's the latency issues, but again, I have to say that if I look at the amount of people concerned about latency before a cloud migration and compare that to the amount of people who actually experience challenges with latency after a cloud migration, it's maybe a tenth.
Absolutely.
So it's I think the biggest challenges are mainly from a what's it called, a lock-in point of view, of saying, if we're going to go to this solution, what are the options that we have for for going somewhere else down the line? But at the same time, I'd say, well, that's the same. It's
the same
not
argument.
It's not a cloud specific thing. It's the same.
Right.
If you, for instance, decide to implement SAP, then it's in for a penny, in for a pound.
Exactly. And then on that note too, I forgot what I was going to say there for a second. Those same organizations. I'm sorry. What we can do now is with multi-cloud. There's a lot of architectures that support spanning dynamically across across infrastructure. So even if we're running multi-regions in AWS, for example, we can still set up either failover or dynamic scaling over to Google Cloud, right? Yes. And then even if AWS were to go down or an entire region were to disappear or something like that, we can very, very easily shift, if you build your applications in the right way, to be able to kind of dynamically just redirect all of your traffic over and then scale up on the other side.
Yes.
That's a very, that's a thing, and that's a relatively new concept that really in the last couple of years has really started to gain a lot of traction, and it's got it's received a lot of vendor support as well, with the vendors that really realize how powerful this is, because it completely eliminates the vendor lock-in argument. And it completely eliminates the idea that well, what happens if there's an AWS outage? Well, we can say, well, we don't care, because we're going to fail over to a completely different provider, right? So kind of it really kind of neutralizes a lot of those concerns around vendor lock-in or anything like that. As more data solutions are moving to the cloud, do you see any changes to associated disciplines like data quality, metadata management, data governance, all of the things that impact companies whenever they're private cloud or whenever they're on premise? Does any of that change whenever they go to the cloud?
Well, I mean, we talked a little bit about Microsoft and Power BI and the what you call it, the spread marks earlier, and I think that's probably one of the things that are that I see the most, is seeing as how it is now much easier for a business user in an organization to say, I need this solution. I have a MasterCard. I am going to go purchase this thing, where you don't really need the explicit consent from IT, or maybe you do, but you have an opportunity to bypass it. I think that's where the biggest maybe strain on these disciplines come, because the bigger the possibilities for you to actually go out and make these solutions on your own, the bigger the risks of unclear definitions and faulty metadata and missing governance and all these is going to be. And again, it's not a cloud challenge. I mean, the same thing happened when when Excel came. The same thing happened when Tableau came. But how can I say it? Maybe the capacity and the capability that you can now go out and get as a business user is much higher and much stronger than it was maybe in the past. So I think there are definitely some things where organizations should I think they should have a clear strategy for saying, what do we have from a data point of view, from an insights point of view, which is controlled, which is clear, where we have the definitions, where we know that when we say financial turnover, we mean this and this and this, but we don't mean this and we don't mean this, so that that when you have the board meetings and people are sitting with the reports, you don't have to one say, well, mine says we're up 5 points, and the other guys are like, well, according to mine, we're down 2, and then they spend 45 minutes arguing over it. So I think that's maybe for the data governance area to rise to the challenge and be able to say, we know that there are needs for people to analyze things and to do stuff on their own, but at the same time, this is something that many people will use to make decisions. Then it needs to be we need to be able to trust the definitions. That's definitely an area that hasn't gotten easier.
So do any of these associated disciplines, like data quality, like metadata management, like data governance, do you see any of these disciplines becoming redundant over time, either because of the cloud or just because in general, we don't need these things anymore?
Well, maybe in a perfect world, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's something that's really going to happen anytime soon. I saw a LinkedIn post here a few days ago where I can't remember his name, but it was someone, I think product manager from Informatica maybe, who said he just had an informal Twitter poll asking his data scientists friends and contacts how something along the lines of how much time did they actually spend doing analysis and making models, and how much did they spend gathering data, cleaning data, preparing data. And from what I remember, he said that 78% of the time was spent gathering data and cleaning data, and 22% was spent analyzing. And I thought, wow, that's almost uncanny when you think about the how many years we've had this thing where we said, well, analysts tend to spend 80% of their time gathering data and 20% analyzing. So that means that we've made an improvement of 2% percentage points in 20 years.
Absolutely.
So I think that, when we work with data, when we talk about data, I think we need always to remember that that we're up against, or we're working with, people and their people's nature, because it is in people's nature, if you're in an organization, to say, oh, by the way, it could also be interesting to, when I create new products or whatever, to have a field covering this, or to have something covering this. And it's also in our nature to say, I need some information about this. Let me try and, gather some stuff, and then I'll, mock about, and then we'll see what comes out. And it's also in people's nature not to document anything.
That's about right.
So I think we're just I think we're I think we're struggling against people's nature. I do think that maybe some of the metadata disciplines are going to get easier. I think it might become easier to align and harmonize. I think many cloud technologies will definitely be able to improve these things. So hopefully it's going to get easier in the future. But yeah.
But we're not there yet, right?
Maybe not quite.
Well, and one of the things that I know is a big impact with this as well is, and this is one of the reasons why the what I kind of call the data disciplines are different than a lot of other types of software engineering type roles. Yes. Because if you're building a front end customer facing app, or even if it's an internal app that you're kind of building for use for your users, then you as the development team kind of have full control over how you want that thing to behave, and so they have the opportunity to enforce those rules on the front end. But whenever we're working with data on the back end, we don't, and we have to deal with whatever we get. And some front end applications are built well from a data governance point of view, some are not. And and one of the ones, for example, that I've seen, I'm certainly not a Navision expert, but I've seen a number of Navision implementations. This was back in the day. I don't know if it's still like that, where in the GUI, in the ERP system, if you have a screen where you can enter customers and you hit a drop down that, so let's say for example, let's say you drop down of countries, and you can either pick one that's in the list, or you can just type anything in that field. And if you do, it'll save whatever you typed. And then so, and everybody says, well, I don't understand what the problem is, until you go back and you look at the data and you profile, okay, well, what countries do we sell to? And you have to spend the next 3 months cleaning your country list to figure out, okay, there's a bunch of stuff in here that makes no sense at all, but it's in our data. So what do we do with it, right?
Exactly.
And that's a problem that you can only fix on the front end, as far as as far as actually implementing that data governance. But frankly, so many organizations don't do that. They're just going to say, you're the data team, you just deal with it, and we'll end up building, just fix it. We'll end up building some mapping rules that they work sometimes, they don't work the other times. But the problem is that we can't predict. We can't predict what the business is going to do next.
Yes.
They might end up with some new customer or some new product or something like that. Maybe we just expanded into a new region, and all of the rules that we worked, they don't work anymore. All the rules that we built, because we have a whole new set of things that we need to account for. And then, the data team doesn't find out about it until well after it's happened, and until, it's like, oh, we've been live in this thing for a month, and now we have a month of bad data that we've got to go clean up, right? And so those types of problems, I think are always, those are kind of really always going to exist, because the people who are building and directing the construct of those front-end apps, data governance is really not a concern that I've ever seen come from kind of the software development world. They're usually a lot more concerned about user interface and general usability and certain features, but data governance is not even on the radar, right? So I think that's one of the things that I really hope that we're going to have some crossover from the data world and be able to kind of loop in a lot of those custom developers, and kind of help them understand why enforcing data governance rules and MDM rules is so important.
Exactly.
And kind of because if we can propagate some of those things to the front end, then it's going to help tremendously. Problem is that we have all of these legacy systems that have been around for decades, right?
Yeah.
That are going to continue running, and even ones that were implemented 5 years ago, they're probably going to be around for another 20 years. And so, you know, because I mean, there's still a shocking number of applications that are still running today that were built in the 1980s or the 1990s, and they're still in operation, you know, and they're still being used on a daily basis. Maybe, you know, they're not maybe used in the same capacity, but the point is that they're still there, and all of the problems that were rolled out in 1982 whenever they built it we're still dealing with them today. You know? So
exactly.
you know, and so I think that's going to be, you know, I kind of hate to say it, but I almost want to, you know, think that I'd be really surprised if these problems are solved within our lifetime, just because of the longevity of these systems. You know, as they tend to happen. You know, it would be great if we could just, you know, flip a switch and then all of our data quality problems are gone. But as long as they're able to continue allowing the bad data in, then we're going to have to deal with it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And I think it also in a way ties back to the, you know, when we talked about the organization part in the beginning, where if you're developing a front end for something, then there's, you know, there's a customer, and then there's a, you know, development team. It's very much a one-to-one. Whereas with the in the data world, the insights world, it's this long chain or a web or whatever we want to call it, of different people who are interested in data from different areas in order to gain different insights, and that's just it's just a whole nother world.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And then, you know, and then the other side of those types of is that even if there is, you know, even if somebody is in the process of building a new system right now, a new front end system for customers or end users or something to enter data into, then the idea that the data team is going to be able to come in there and influence it whenever they've already set a budget, they've already set a timeline, and then we as the data architects are going to come in and go, okay, time out, you can't do that, we have to redesign. Like, the budget's the budget, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And just because the data team doesn't like it doesn't mean that the budget's going to change. And so they're, you know, so the team that's building that app is going to do whatever they're going to do, and then we're going to deal with it on the back end.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think I've ever seen an instance where somebody in a data role was actually able to go and you know, and successfully make that argument and get more money and get more time for a project because of, you know, because of respective data quality issues, I guess I should say, right? It's not until after. Though. What's that?
I said we do try, though.
We do try, but I could be wrong, but I can't remember a single instance where anybody ever successfully went and made that argument and actually got a project delayed or more money allocated or something like that, so they could deal with that. So it's you know, unfortunately, right, you know, until, you know, and I think this is, especially in larger organizations, this is really kind of an enterprise architecture issue, because it's really kind of something that they need to be, you know, they need to be having ownership of. But you know, even still, in a lot of those organizations, the enterprise architects, they're in the same boat, where they don't find out about it until the project is in flight. You know, the budget was written a year ago, and they get to deal with whatever they get to deal with. And, you know, and this is something that I've seen working for a number of very large organizations in the past. As a consultant, we'll come in and we'll build something, and then we'll try to get it into production, and then they'll say, okay, stop, you've got to go clear this with the enterprise architects, and then you'll go bring it to them, and they don't even know what your project is. They've never seen this before, right? They never signed off on it, they never got clearance on it, and here you are, you're ready to put V1 into production, and, you know, and then you have all of these things that they want you to go do, but guess what? You know, the company didn't budget for that. So you know, you kind of have to deal with the most critical issues, and then get those over the get those over the goal line. And, you know, but realistically, a lot of those, you know, kind of thorn in the side type issues like data quality are usually not addressed. Or the other thing is documentation, because nobody ever budgets for documentation, right?
Exactly.
That's not a thing that ever happens. It's like, okay, you're done building the app, project over, even though, you know, you probably need another 20% of the budget to actually document how the thing works. So You know, that's one of the things I've never seen a project that actually had documentation written into the budget where, you know, and actually had timeline that says, okay, here's the time we're going to do this, you know, and even if you end up writing a little bit of buffer into it, you know, as far as the estimate goes, that usually ends up getting swallowed up by something else that's more important than documentation. And, you know, usually it's bug fixing or something along those lines. And, you know, if you're lucky, you can get a little bit of documentation done, right? So it's a very interesting organizational problem that unfortunately I don't see going away anytime soon.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
How do you see the maturity of cloud-based solutions at some of the companies that you've been working with?
Well, I think it's. I think we touched a little bit on this earlier, but I think it's definitely something that's increasing, well, quite dramatically. I mean, there's the maturity, and then there's just the you know, the daring to do it, and what I see is also this where, you know, people start relatively small. They say, well, we have a what's it called, an expense management solution, so let's try and buy, you know, something cloud-based, and then you buy that and you realize, oh, things don't fall apart, and then you try with maybe an HR system, or you try with a CRM system, and I think the maturity in organizations is definitely growing in this space. And also, as we talked about on the data side, where it's going from where you needed previously to build much more yourself, where you're actually able to get much more mature solutions right now, which can help you with your data analysis need and data processing needs in a way that you could only have dreamt of 5 years ago.
And what are some of the reasons where you have seen a cloud migration, really kind of any kind, be deemed as a failure? You know, after they went through a substantial portion of the project, they tried to put a system on, and they came back and said, this isn't just going to work, we need to roll this back.
I'm just trying to think here. I think most of the failures I've seen have mainly been related to you know, business process areas, or of missing alignment or missing data. I typically don't see a lot of challenges where you can say, all right, well, that's because of the decision to use a cloud solution here. The only things I can think of is that especially to begin with, people tended. We talked about the infrastructure side of things earlier on, and we talked about how there was some hesitation of adopting a cloud. And I think that in many of the organizations where I've been, people on the infrastructure side of things have also become much more aware and mature when it comes to cloud adoption. So that's also definitely helped in that area. But typically, well, a few times I've seen performance issues, but actually not so much in the data space, but more sort of in the sort of things like Office 365, those types of things. So it's
right.
It's happened, but it's I'd say not more than, you know, any other average IT project.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would agree. I've seen, I mean, there's been a few issues that I've seen where companies, they didn't really put enough thought into their infrastructure, and they weren't doing a full cloud migration, because usually, companies don't do that. They're going to do a little bit at a time, and whenever they do that, they haven't really dealt with the capacity or bandwidth issues that they're dealing with on their existing infrastructure. And so they, and probably the most common case that I've seen is where they just really can't get data out of their old systems fast enough and over the wire and land it onto the cloud platforms. And then they'll look at the cloud system and go, wow, this cloud thing was a failure, but the failure is really with their ability to, it's really, well, it might be to do with their upstream network pipe. It might be to do with their on-premise database that they're running, because that's a very common problem, obviously, with existing data warehouse and data lake systems that are just capacity constrained. And then putting cloud on top of that isn't going to help, because you still have to get the data there. So those are some of the common ones that I've seen. And then I guess I probably wouldn't call it a failure, but I would probably say, along the lines like I talked about earlier with lift and shift, where yes, we can technically take all of our infrastructure and put it in the cloud, but we just 4x'd our cost or something like that.
Exactly.
And so it's not like it doesn't work. It's just a lot more expensive because we didn't go through that effort to kind of figure out the right way to do it whenever whenever we did that migration, right?
I think the finance area would probably call that a failure.
They probably would, yeah. But so I think that's one of those gray areas where IT is going to declare it a success, and then finance is going to say no, that was bad, right?
Yeah.
So, but on the other hand, just because it does cost more doesn't mean, they could have very well solved some of their other problems.
Definitely.
Related to outages or related to the ability to take good backups and things like that, because obviously that's still a big issue with a lot of on-premise systems, especially with relational databases, to be able to, have enough horsepower, enough disk IO, and enough CPU to actually be able to take those backups without, causing a lot of other problems. And so it's very, very possible that you could lift and shift one of those databases and practically eliminate that bottleneck, right? Because you can throw the hardware at that you need to be able to do that. So so that might be one of those things where finance says, I don't understand the benefits, but IT says, look, we have backups that work now, right?
Exactly.
And we didn't before.
Pretty good risk mitigation there.
Exactly. What are the biggest inhibitors that you see today, and really probably for the next few years, that are keeping companies from being truly data driven?
There's a large I think there's a large technical component to it, of actually getting the analytic solutions up and running, the big data solutions, getting the right, getting them fed with the right data. But I think actually I think organizationally there are big challenges, both from a resource perspective of how do you get the right the right data engineers, how do you get the right developers, how do you get the right data scientists, but some of the things that I've seen as well are have to do with mindsets, because being data driven is it really is, if you're let's say you're a sales, you're head of sales for a large company, and you've been there for 20 years and you've worked your way up, and you know all the ins and outs, and you know all the small things, and you know what this customer want, and you know that we need to do this in Q3 because of such and such. And then at some point you have this data scientist type come in and say, oh, by the way, everything we thought we knew about sales is wrong. So we should do it this way instead. I think that there's a large resistance to change on the decision maker level. And of course, this is an extreme example, but it's something that I see in organizations sort of all the way down, where if you have a data scientist saying, oh, by the way, I've made a new model for how we do our supply chain planning, then you can be absolutely sure that the supply chain planners and probably also the IT guys manning the supply chain system are going to say, that can't be right.
Exactly.
You're obviously missing something. This is bad. I
Well,
mean,
and
that's
that's also the same thing that whenever you do an ERP implementation, I've seen this numerous times with SAP, whenever you're coming in to implement SAP for the first time, and it's very much the same way. They've got a very specific process for how supply chain works, right? And most likely that's not how your department already operates. And so it's this idea of going to the business unit and saying, okay, this is how you're going to do things now. And usually that doesn't go over very well, and so, so you have to go do that with every single business. You've got to do it with finance, you've got to do it with manufacturing, with logistics, with customer service, with, order fulfillment, all the way down the line, and kind of do that exact same process. And so it's very much, it's very much an organizational problem. And I mean, and that's not even necessarily, whenever you're implementing SAP, I've been on a few of those implementations, and that's not a data project. That's not anything that they're looking at the data and saying, this is how we need to do it. They're putting a cookie cutter, implementation for the most part on top of it and saying, this is how you run a manufacturing business. It doesn't matter what you're making, this is how you run it. And, and it's something that's worked very well for a lot of organizations for 30, 35 years, right? And so it's not something that they're really, like there's not a lot of debate as to whether this is the right thing to do or not. But whenever you actually go and implement it at a company, they're like, well, wait a minute, this can't be right because this isn't how we do things, right?
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
There was another conversation that I was actually having just yesterday with another great a data leader that I know, and we were kind of talking about the idea of hippos that are sabotaging projects, either intentionally or unintentionally, for a lot of reasons. But one of those reasons is because it kind of, that whatever you're doing doesn't align with the way that they think things should work, or the way that they've done things in the past, or something like that. Those end up being really big problems to actually getting things done. And one of the things that I see, and I can't actually think of a company that I have worked at or consulted at that wasn't like this, where you didn't have at least one very person in the company that's a VP level or an executive director or a CXO that is the quote unquote expert in the application that you're using. And as soon as you bring a data quality to them and you say, look, I found, millions of dollars in sales in a place that you say that you don't sell to. And they say, that can't be right. That's impossible. The data's bad. You need to go, look at this again or whatever. And it usually ends up being much more difficult than that. I'm putting it very, very lightly about how some of those conversations go. And, but the idea is, I mean, the data doesn't lie. Right.
Exactly.
You can clearly see these transactions. You've got sales orders, you've got purchase order numbers, you've got SKUs, these things exist. You bought them, they're in your system, you sold them or whatever. And I'm showing that to you and you're telling me that it's wrong. Right. And so there's just a huge amount of that in organizations. And as soon as you start to kind of roll out these systems that really kind of wipe that lens clean and allow the whole business to see how things are really working, there's a lot of people that feel threatened by it, because it really kind of upsets the way that they are used to doing business. And so I think that's one of the big things that have really kind of inhibited that adoption I say it's part politics, but it's also part of the idea that we don't like the way that things are going to work in the future, because we have we have a way to do things, and we don't like the idea that this is going to be visible to other people in the business, for all sorts of reasons. And so some of them are innocuous, and some of them are not innocuous. I mean, I've certainly seen numerous examples in the past of just outright fraud that's been implemented by, you know, a pretty high level executive that we found pretty quickly and pretty easily, you know, and then we show that to everybody and they say, no, you can't show these numbers to anybody, you know. And so, you know, it's like, but if we, you know, you gotta understand, if we roll the system out, this is something that, you know, it's going to be very obvious to everybody that this is happening, right? And so that's been one of the really big blockers that I've seen for a lot of projects. And I have seen numerous occasions where executives pull plug on a project because something like that's happening, because, well, wait a minute, you know, we thought we were going to get something, quote unquote actionable out of this, but instead we found that one of our guys is committing fraud, or that we found, you know, that we, you know, that we have this ridiculous waste over here, but, you know, but this happens to be an influential person in my company, so we're not going to do anything about it, you know, and we have no intention of doing anything about it. We just want to, like, we want to do these other things. And so, you know, and then they'll kind of look at the whole project and say, no, this is gonna, you know, this isn't going to go over well politically for us to roll the system out. And then so they'll either roll it back, or they'll do something along those lines where, you know, you don't end up actually going live with whatever thing that it is you're working on, because you know, you're stepping on somebody's toes, and you know, and you're making somebody look bad. Again, whether it's intentional or not, it doesn't really matter so much, right? Because there's, you know, you're either exposing, you know, in some cases gross incompetence, or you're exposing, you know, business process failures, or you're exposing fraud, or who knows what you're going to find, right? But it absolutely happens, and so that's one of the things that I've seen that have been big, that have been really big blockers for actually getting, you know, getting data products and data platforms, you know, getting the business to actually finish implementing them and start using them, and actually start using them to change their business. You know, you've really got to have that top-down directive from the C-suite that says, yes, we're going to do this, and everybody really kind of needs to agree, or at least the CEO needs to have the authority to stand up and say, we're going to do this, you know. And you can't cave to that political pressure in your organization, because if you do, it's gonna, you know, it's not going to work.
Exactly. I think also the sort of the mindset thing at the sort of the business analyst level, of people tending to you know, try and find answers on their own, which in and of itself is a fantastic trait, but which often gets us to a lot of faulty conclusions, and a lot of
That's true,
reports which are just incorrect and inconsistent. So I think a lot more understanding and support in saying, well, this is, you know, this is IT and it's data, but it's also something completely different. It's also, you know, people trying to get answers, and we should try and help them get the right answers.
Trying to get correct answers, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And also, you know, the flip side of that coin is get them to help define, well, what is a correct answer? Because which of these 5 definitions of financial turnover is actually the right one?
which is another thing that will end you know, in a lot of cases arguing with some you know, some influential hippos about it in a number of organizations, where, you know, you'll go to somebody and you'll say, well, you know, how do you measure employee turnover? And then they'll come back and they'll say, well, what do you mean there's only one way to do it? And then go survey their organization, find out that they are using at least, you know, 4, 6, 8, 10 different ways to do it, depending on who you ask, you know. And so, you know, that's a huge mindset shift to be able to, you know, throughout the whole organization, to say, okay, we're going to have a standard definition for how we're going to do things. And then on top of that, you've really got to have standard systems, because you know, as long as you're allowing people to kind of do things in Excel on their own, you really completely lose that visibility into what they're doing, and you can't really audit it. Whereas if you have it in a governed system, you know, it should be working the same way throughout the entire, you know, right throughout the entire life cycle of that data, you know. And you know, and that doesn't mean that people can't create their own own dashboards, they absolutely can and they should. But we need to make sure that all of those definitions, that you have a data dictionary that defines what employee turnover is, how you calculate it, and that is enforced uniformly throughout that organization. And that's one of the things that I think I would say very, very few organizations I think have really kind of done correctly, because there's almost always some people in some departments or some business units that can kind of do whatever they want to, and they'll just download all of the data, they'll do all of their work in Excel, or they'll build their own Access databases or something like that, even though they already have a thing that does this, and and then they'll try to recreate the wheel, and they'll end up recreating it, not to necessarily say that it's wrong, but it's different. Yes. And and so now we're back to having multiple definitions of what is employee turnover and how do you calculate this number. And then corporate says, give me your employee turnover number, and here's a number which is fundamentally calculated differently than the way the rest of the business does it. Exactly. And then they'll start to measure you with those KPIs and say, okay, business unit, you need to get your number from X to Y. And in whenever that happens, right, in performance management organizations, that's another problem on that side, where most of those performance management people don't understand that this is a problem. They don't, the concept that you can measure this metric two different ways doesn't even register. Of course. And, but that's how they're measuring their employees' performance. Yeah, exactly. And so, or that's how they're measuring the business unit's performance. And so it makes it very, very easy for them to have incorrect data. It's also easy for them to manipulate their numbers, either intentionally or unintentionally, with exactly what it is they're doing. And and I've seen a number of organizations that did this as well, that actually tried to go through this process and say, okay, we need to standardize the way that these things are calculated, and they just they would spend a lot of money and a lot of time on it, and they figured out it was just kind of too difficult to do politically, and they kind of just gave up. As far as going to all of the business units and say, okay guys, you need to, number one, stop using Excel and Access and all of these to do these things, get on, everybody needs to be using the same platform. But then number two, you have to get everybody to agree on how these things are calculated, and create standard processes for collecting this data. And usually, unless it's a really, really, really bad problem, an organization usually doesn't want to go through that, because it ends up, especially at a big company, ends up being very, very intrusive and expensive to do. And one of the big areas where I've seen this a fair amount is human resources, where where you're trying to get just some very basic data about when people are hired, when they're fired, not even taking into account salary data or anything like that. It's very, very, very difficult to get human resources data. And and so whenever you're going and implementing all these change management processes that says, okay, we're going to do this thing where we're going to start measuring our business units on employee turnover, for example, and then we want to actually quantify that data, it becomes a very difficult thing to do, because you've got the people on the business side that they don't want to give you the data, and and they'll just kind of spoon feed you a little bit and say, oh, this is all that you need, and and that completely eliminates that data governance and change management side of it, because there's nobody double checking these numbers to make sure that they're accurate, and and I think in a lot of cases you find out if you actually do get access to it that they're not, and and in a lot of those cases they've never been right. And I've seen quite a bit of that, where you look at it and go, wow, your numbers are off by 20%, and they've been like that for decades. And and that's another one of those instances where the stakeholders don't want to believe you. Think, oh, that's not possible. We've been operating since the 1960s, and this has never been a problem. Like, well, just because you weren't looking at it doesn't mean it wasn't happening, right? Exactly. So now from my point of view, I mean, those are some of the really big ones for inhibitors on being data driven. It's just the ability to, it's the ability to trust your data, to understand your data, and then be able to not be threatened by it, and then ultimately act on it. Right? Is to say, okay, we've got a system, we have a uniform way to agree on what employee turnover means. Now we're going to actually go use this data to do something. And and it sounds very trivial, but there's just so many steps that have that you have to get through to get from point A to point B to point C, and get everybody in alignment before you can finally say, yes, we can really execute this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's excellent. That was my last question. Do you have any final thoughts? The floor is yours.
Oh, I think we've covered it pretty well. I think I'll say that I mean, given how much this area and this domain has changed and evolved in the last 5 years, I'm very, very curious and excited to see what happens next. Because I think that there are going to be some big shifts, and at the same time, I think that the things we discuss here at the end, I think they're everlasting. So I think we should schedule a follow-up in 5 years from now and then see how things look.
I agree. I have a hunch that that most of these organizational problems are not going to be any different than they were 5 years from now, and that our technology landscape is going to have another pretty dramatic shift probably in 5 years. But it's not.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Any of the fundamental problems around data quality or around adoption, or the things that cause projects to succeed or fail in the eyes of the business, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, so I thank you very much for your time, Rasmus. This was great. I know it's a little bit late over there, but it's been a fun conversation.
It's been a pleasure.
Hopefully we can do it again. Hopefully we can do it again sometime, and we'll make sure to put all of your contact information in the in the link in the post and the videos, so everybody can go meet Rasmus. And thank you very much, everybody, for Cloud Data Summit podcast.